My wife, Clara, was admitted to a local hospital 25 years ago, and since then, I haven't seen her again. At that time, Clara began to show strange symptoms: high fever, delirium, and a weakness that made no sense given her age and health. We rushed to the hospital, seeking answers and treatment. At first, the doctors were confused, jumping from one diagnosis to another without certainty. Daily visits to the hospital became a routine, and each day felt like torture, watching Clara wasting away before my eyes. I remember one afternoon in particular. Clara was lying in bed, her eyes lost, and when she saw me, a flicker of recognition shone in her gaze. I held her hand, feeling the cold and frail touch. "Everything will be okay," I said, trying to convince myself as much as her. But the feeling of helplessness was overwhelming. The doctors came in and out of the room, whispering among themselves, and I could only catch fragments of their conversations. Rare case, quarantine, further investigation. As the days passed, Clara was transferred to an isolated ward of the hospital. I was informed it was for safety reasons, to prevent the spread of any possible infection. But something didn't seem right. Every time I asked about Clara's condition, I received vague answers and promises that they were doing their best. My anxiety grew, and I began to have disturbing dreams about Clara, where she called to me from a distant place, surrounded by shadows and echoing screams of pain. The nights were the worst. The house, which was once full of laughter and love, was now steeped in silence and despair. I clung to any hope, but with each visit to the hospital, that hope diminished. The days turned into weeks, and each attempt to see Clara was met with excuses and bureaucracy. The last time I saw my wife, she was so weak she could barely speak, but her eyes pleaded for help. I promised her I would do everything to get her out of there. Little did I know that would be the last promise I would make to Clara. Eventually, after many frustrating attempts, I was banned from entering the hospital. They claimed it was for safety reasons, but I knew there was something more. Something dark and sinister was happening, and Clara was at the center of it all. The feeling of loss and helplessness consumed me, and from that moment on, my life became an endless search for answers that never came. After a few weeks, I was informed that Clara had been transferred to a special ward. When I tried to visit her, I was stopped by security guards who told me the ward was off-limits for safety reasons. Desperate, I sought answers, but all I found were closed doors and suspicious looks from the staff. I began to suspect that something terrible was happening in that hospital, something they didn't want me to know. My nights turned into nightmares, where I saw Clara calling to me, trapped in a dark and inaccessible place. One day, while insisting on seeing my wife, I met a nurse who seemed more willing to talk. He pulled me aside and, looking around nervously, whispered, "They're hiding something in the special ward. Clara isn't the only patient there. There are others." My heart froze. That brief encounter only increased my determination to uncover the truth. I started asking questions to patients and visitors at the hospital, but most seemed too scared to talk. As the days passed, my frustration grew. The hospital refused to give me detailed information about Clara's condition. Phone calls were brief and impersonal, and the letters I sent never received replies. I began to feel that Clara was being held captive. In desperation, I started watching the hospital at night, hoping to find a way to sneak into the special ward. One night, I saw a group of men leaving the hospital, carrying what looked like scientific equipment. I decided to follow them. They entered an unmarked van and, after a long drive, arrived at an abandoned building on the outskirts of town. From a distance, I watched them unload box after box, entering the mysterious building. The scene disturbed me. What was the hospital hiding? And why was Clara involved? The idea that my wife was being used as a guinea pig in inhuman experiments tormented me. I began collecting evidence, taking photos and noting every suspicious detail. But the more I discovered, the more dangerous the situation became. One night, as I returned home, I realized I was being followed. I looked in the rearview mirror and saw a black car speeding up when I tried to confront it. I knew I was dealing with something much bigger and more sinister than I could imagine. Even so, I couldn't give up on Clara. I needed to uncover the truth and, above all, save her from this nightmare. Each passing day, I felt time running out. The feeling of helplessness and despair was overwhelming, but my determination to find my wife and expose the truth kept me going. One day, I received an anonymous letter. In it, someone claimed to have information about what really happened to Clara. The letter mentioned secret medical experiments conducted on patients in the ward where my wife was admitted. I decided to investigate on my own, and with the help of a friend, we managed to sneak into the hospital at night. What we found was terrifying. Empty rooms, abandoned medical equipment, and an eerie silence. In one of the rooms, there was a diary that seemed to belong to one of the doctors, describing macabre and inhuman procedures. The diary was full of detailed descriptions of bizarre experiments. Some patients were subjected to procedures that bordered on torture, all in the name of science and medicine. There were mentions of a revolutionary cure being tested on patients without their consent. Clara was mentioned several times in the diary, always referred to as Patient 47. I discovered that she had been chosen for being ideal for the tests due to her mysterious condition. The pages of the diary revealed a terrifying truth. Clara and other patients were exposed to unknown chemicals and subjected to invasive procedures. Some survived, but with terrible sequelae. Others simply disappeared. With each page I read, my heart tightened. The image of Clara, helpless and suffering, haunted me. The doctor's notes were cold and impersonal, treating the patients as mere study objects. My friend and I decided to explore the hospital further. We found a locked room, hidden at the back of the special ward. We broke open the door, and what we saw was horrifying. There were stretchers with restraining straps, syringes, and vials scattered everywhere. In a corner of the room, there was a small table with documents that looked like experiment reports. I took all the documents I could, hoping to find something that would lead me to Clara. Among the papers, I found a worn photo of Clara. She was lying on a stretcher, eyes closed, with an expression of pain on her face. Next to the photo was a note: Procedure 12 reaction test to substance X23. My blood ran cold reading that. I didn't know what substance X23 was, but it was clear that Clara had been subjected to something horrible. We left the hospital with the evidence, but my mind was in turmoil. Was Clara alive? If so, where was she now? And who had sent me the anonymous letter? With each step, I felt I was getting closer to the truth, but also diving into an abyss of horror I never imagined facing. I needed answers, and above all, I needed to find Clara, no matter the cost. At the end of the diary, there was a note about a patient matching Clara's description. She had undergone an experiment that, according to the doctor, could change the course of medicine, but the result was tragic. Clara was never found, and the hospital was closed shortly afterward. To this day, I live with the anguish of not knowing what really happened to her. And sometimes, when I'm alone, I feel a cold presence beside me, as if Clara were trying to reach me from the other side. With the information I gathered, I approached authorities and journalists, but no one seemed willing to believe or investigate. With no options, I decided to go public on my own. I published a blog detailing the experiments and Clara's disappearance. The account gained traction on social media, and soon, other relatives of missing patients began sharing their stories. It seemed Clara wasn't the only victim. One night, while reviewing the documents, I noticed an inconsistency in the dates of the procedures. One of the notes mentioned an address outside the hospital, an old warehouse on the outskirts of town. I decided to investigate. I arrived at the location at midnight, armed with a flashlight and a heart pounding with fear and hope. The warehouse was in ruins, but at the back, I found a steel door, partially covered by debris. With considerable effort, I managed to open the door. The interior was dark and stuffy, the smell of mold and chemicals filling the air. I walked down a narrow corridor until I reached a room lit by flickering fluorescent lights. The room was an improvised laboratory, with vials and papers scattered across tables. In a corner, an old computer was still on, displaying video files. I watched the videos in horror. They showed the experiments performed on Clara and other patients. The images were disturbing. Clara, tied to a stretcher, receiving injections of unknown substances. Her screams of pain echoing through the lab. The doctors, impassive, noting each reaction. In one of the videos, Clara looked directly at the camera, her eyes pleading for help. I felt a lump in my throat, tears streaming down my face.